Every single day, around 21 million barrels of oil are just squeezed through this stretch of water that is so incredibly narrow. I mean, the navigable shipping lanes in some places are, well, they're just 2 miles wide in either direction.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So just think about the sheer concentration of, wealth and energy passing through that tiny, tiny geographical bottleneck.
And the completely unavoidable geopolitical tension that just naturally comes with it, because you have these massive commercial tankers, heavily armed naval vessels, and local coast guards all operating literally within a stone's throw of each other. I mean, the stakes really couldn't possibly be higher.
Exactly. So welcome to this deep dive. Today we are exploring this really fascinating and frankly high-stakes geopolitical and legal chess game happening in one of the most critical maritime choke points on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
It is.
Yeah.
And we're pulling our insights today from a really detailed piece by Strategic Vanguard, and it's titled The Law and Sovereignty of the Strait of Hormuz.
And, the value of this specific document is that it really strips away the daily news headlines, right? It forces us to look at an incredibly volatile situation through this purely legal and structural lens. So it focuses entirely on the actual mechanics of international maritime law.
Which is, I should say, strictly our mission for today's deep dive. We are just exploring the legal frameworks and the geopolitical realities outlined in this source material. We are definitely not taking political sides here, and we aren't judging the morality of any of the actors involved.
Right, exactly.
We are just merely uncovering how international maritime law actually operates and, well, sometimes spectacularly fails to operate when billions of dollars are on the line. And if you are out there wondering why you should personally care about some narrow stretch of water thousands of miles away, it's honestly pretty simple.
Yeah, it hits close to home.
It really does. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. It is the absolute primary artery for the world's energy supplies. So whether you are analyzing supply chain logistics for a boardroom meeting, studying global trade, or literally just paying for gas at the pump, a bottleneck in this waterway directly dictates the numbers in your bank account.
Yeah, the economic density is just staggering. I mean, a single localized disruption there, it doesn't just raise fuel prices, it completely alters the cost of manufacturing, the price of agricultural fertilizers, and the shipping costs of nearly every consumer good globally.
Okay, so to understand the current debate over whether a coastal state like Iran, for example, could potentially collect tolls from ships passing through the strait, we first have to understand the geography of the choke point itself. And of course, this specific international law is designed to keep it open.
Because it's not just open water.
Right. Let's look at the physical reality of navigating this space. It is definitely not a wide open ocean where ships can just, casually chart their own course.
No, the geography forces intense regulation. Because the navigable width is so restricted, vessels cannot simply wander around. They're confined to these incredibly precise traffic separations schemes.
So what, exactly?
They are essentially virtual highways painted on the water. They dictate exactly where inbound and outbound traffic must flow just to prevent, catastrophic collisions between a mega oil tanker and a massive container ship.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because this is where the legal architecture comes in to actually manage that traffic.
Yeah.
The source text leans really heavily on UNCLOS, right? The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Yes, exactly.
People often refer to it as the Constitution for the Oceans. And it basically defines maritime zones, navigation rights, and the responsibilities of both the coastal states and the foreign ships that are using those waters. And the absolute cornerstone of this whole framework for the Strait of Hormuz is a concept called transit passage.
Yeah. Transit passage is the definitive legal mechanism here. It governs straits that are used for international navigation, and it was engineered by the international community to balance two very conflicting realities.
Right.
On one hand, you have the coastal state's sovereignty over its territorial waters, but on the other hand, you have the global economy's absolute dependence on uninterrupted shipping. So under UNCLOS, ships, and notably aircraft as well, which is an important detail, are granted the right of transit passage.
Meaning they get a free pass.
Basically, it means they must be allowed to pass continuously and expeditiously without interference.
I want to look at the mechanical difference here for a second, because transit passage is actually a very specific upgrade from standard innocent passage, right? Like if a warship is just passing through regular territorial waters under innocent passage, submarines have to surface and show their flag.
Right, they can't hide.
Yeah, and aircraft carriers cannot launch or recover planes. But under transit passage, through a critical choke point like Hormuz naval vessels, can just operate in their normal mode.
Yeah.
Submarines can stay completely submerged. That seems like a massive concession of control from the coastal state.
Oh, it is a profound limitation on their sovereignty. I mean, the coastal states bordering the strait, they absolutely retain ownership of their territorial waters, but they are legally prohibited from hampering or suspending that navigation. They just have to allow the passage.
I'm trying to picture how this works in like everyday domestic terms. It sounds to me like a really aggressive property easement.
Ooh, yeah. That's a good way to look at it.
Like you buy a piece of land, but there's a legally binding easement written right into the deed that says your neighbor's driveway cuts right across your front yard.
Exactly.
You own the yard, you pay the property taxes on the yard, but if you park your car in that driveway or try to put up a gate, you are technically breaking the law.
The easement framework captures that dynamic perfectly. You have sovereignty, but it is heavily encumbered by the rights of others. Now, the coastal state can adopt specific regulations. I mean, they can enforce maritime safety rules, they can mandate pollution controls, and they absolutely can require ships to use those traffic separation schemes we mentioned earlier.
Right, the virtual highways.
Yeah, but they cannot use those regulations as some sort of backdoor method to suspend or impede the fundamental right of passage. The entire system is basically built from the ground up to guarantee that global trade routes remain open and predictable.
Which naturally brings us to the real friction point the Strategic Vanguard highlights in the document. If you own the territory, but you are legally forbidden from blocking the ships, the next logical geopolitical move isn't a blockade.
No, it's not.
It's a toll booth. And this shifts the text from these broad maritime rights into the highly specific debate over whether a coastal state could actually legally collect transit fees.
And the text of UNCLOS is actually very rigid on this initially. It strictly prohibits general tolls. You simply cannot levy a charge upon a foreign ship solely for the privilege of passing through the territorial sea.
Meaning you can't just charge a cover fee just for existing in the water.
Right, exactly.
But there is an exception for specific services, right? Like if a state provides a tangible service, say pilotage, where a local maritime expert comes aboard to actually guide a tanker through a hazardous reef or, I don't know, emergency towing services, they are absolutely allowed to send a bill for that. That's just standard commercial compensation.
Yes. The legal distinction is supposed to be very clear-cut. General transit taxes, illegal. Compensation for requested services, legal. But, as we know, international law is rarely immune to creative interpretation.
Not surprisingly.
Yeah. The text outlines this massive potential loophole. What happens when a coastal state frames a mandatory fee not as a general toll, but as a compensation for environmental protection measures or navigational infrastructure?
I was looking at that exact section in the text. I mean, if a coastal state suddenly says, hey, we aren't charging you to pass, we are just charging you an environmental monitoring fee because your giant mega tankers are degrading our local ecosystem, how do you even begin to litigate that?
It's incredibly difficult.
Right. There is no mathematical formula in UNCLOS that spits out an approved dollar amount for like acoustic pollution from a ship's propeller. Who decides what is proportional?
What's fascinating here is that this exact ambiguity is the battleground. The text notes that any such fee would be subjected to the legal tests of proportionality and non-discrimination.
Okay.
So if a state imposes a fee for maintaining navigational aids or, say, monitoring for oil spills, the charge must be directly proportional to the actual cost of the services rendered. It cannot be a thinly veiled mechanism just to generate massive state revenue.
Got it. But the non-discrimination clause, that seems like the much harder rule to enforce in reality. The convention states you can't selectively target ships based on their flag or cargo, meaning you can't charge oil tankers from a geopolitical rival double the rate while letting all your allies pass for free.
In theory, yes, uniform application is required. In practice, maintaining strict neutrality in the Persian Gulf, which is, one of the most politically charged environments on the planet, is a monumental challenge.
Oh, I bet.
A coastal state might very easily find pretexts to rigorously inspect or heavily fine ships belonging to rivals. They'll just cite safety concerns, right? While simultaneously fast-tracking friendly vessels.
Wow. And the source material also introduces a completely separate legal headache regarding customary international law, because not every country actually signed and ratified UNCLOS.
That's a huge point.
The United States, for example, recognizes many of its provisions, but never formally ratified the treaty. And Iran signed it, but hasn't ratified it either. So you have this bizarre scenario where a state might argue that the specific, highly restrictive rules of transit passage are just treaty obligations.
Right.
And that they only apply to fully ratified members, so they aren't bound by them in the same way.
And major maritime powers counter that exact argument by stating that the core principles of UNCLOS, including transit passage, have been practiced so consistently for so long that they have crystallized into what we call customary international law.
Meaning everyone has to play by the rules regardless.
Exactly. It means they are globally binding regardless of who signed a specific piece of paper. But of course, the coastal states may reject that interpretation entirely. They argue that customary law doesn't just force them to give up their sovereign right to control their own waters.
So what does this all actually mean for us? We have this framework full of undefined environmental loopholes, and we don't even have unanimous agreement on which countries are bound by the rules.
Yeah.
What actually happens when a coastal state just goes ahead and sets up the toll booth, declares it a completely legal environmental fee, and then a foreign shipping fleet just calls it an illegal tax and refuses to pay?
Wow.
Because this brings us to the harshest reality outlined in the deep dive today, the enforcement gap.
Yeah, the enforcement gap is the fundamental vulnerability of all international law. The whole system relies entirely on states voluntarily agreeing to participate. There is no global maritime police force patrolling the Strait of Hormuz, just waiting to dismantle an illegal toll booth or arrest a coastal state official for violating UNCLOS Article 43.
Right. Now, UNCLOS does outline a formal dispute resolution process, right? It has tribunals. I know you can take a grievance to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea or push for arbitration.
You can't.
But the text makes it painfully clear. These processes require the consent and the good faith of the states involved. You file a case, you spend years arguing over jurisdiction, and even if a tribunal eventually issues a definitive ruling that a specific toll is entirely illegal, there is no enforcement mechanism.
None. And this raises a really important question. How do you constrain a sovereign entity that just refuses to be constrained?
Yeah.
I mean, domestic law works because there is a monopoly on force. If you ignore a court order, the police arrive. But in the international arena, tribunals can clarify legal principles, but they absolutely cannot compel a state to change its behavior.
I think of it less like a courtroom and honestly more like a massive global homeowners association.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to put it.
Right. Everyone bought into the neighborhood and signed the CCNRs,
Right.
but the HOA board have absolutely zero authority to actually fine you or put a lien on your house.
Yeah.
So when someone paints their house neon green or blocks the shared road, the HOA can send angry letters pointing to the rule book. But ultimately, resolving the dispute devolves into neighbors just passively aggressively blockading each other's driveways.
Yeah, exactly. And in maritime disputes, that passive-aggressive blockade translates into states utilizing their own strategic tools to basically force compliance.
Right.
The text highlights diplomatic engagement and economic sanctions as the initial levers. But, when billions of dollars of oil are at stake and a choke point is physically threatened, states rapidly escalate to a naval presence.
Which brings us to the physical reality of freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs.
Yeah.
Because this isn't just a sternly worded diplomatic cable. This is a state sending a heavily armed guided missile destroyer to sail straight through the strait, deliberately ignoring the coastal state's demands or fees, purely to physically demonstrate that the waters are open under international law.
A phonombi is the ultimate expression of state practice. It is basically a legal argument made with a warship.
Wow.
The transiting state is aggressively asserting its interpretation of transit passage, directly challenging what it views as excessive maritime claims.
But let's look at the mechanics of how that actually plays out on the water. You have a foreign destroyer entering a 2-mile-wide shipping lane. The coastal state's radar picks them up. The coastal state's navy or, fast attack craft are deployed to intercept or just shadow the destroyer.
Or they get right up next to them.
Yeah. And then you have these incredibly tense radio communications where the coastal state demands compliance and the destroyer responds that they're operating lawfully in international waters.
Yeah.
I mean, the risk of miscalculation there is just astronomical.
It really is. A single misunderstood radio call, a warning shot that accidentally strikes a hull, or even just a vessel executing a maneuver that the other side interprets as hostile intent.
Yeah.
The situation can transition from a dry legal dispute over a maritime fee into a kinetic military conflict in literally a matter of seconds.
The text is careful to note that countermeasures by affected states must remain proportional, though.
Yeah.
Like, you can't launch massive airstrikes just because someone demanded a $50 toll. The legal framework is supposed to act as a constraint on how violently states can respond to a dispute.
The constraint exists in theory, absolutely. But in practice, once naval assets are actively engaging each other in a confined choke point, the momentum of escalation often vastly outpaces any legal calculations. Leaders are forced to make split-second decisions based on survival and national pride, not on careful readings of UNCLOS proportionality clauses.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. The force points out that you don't actually need a warship standoff to trigger a massive global crisis.
No, you don't.
The true weapon in this scenario isn't a kinetic strike at all. It's economic uncertainty. The commercial shipping companies, the entities that are actually moving the cargo, they are constantly running risk assessments.
Yeah, because commercial shipping operates on razor-thin margins. A vessel carrying $100 million worth of crude oil cannot afford to just sit idle, nor can it afford to be detained by a coastal state over a disputed fee.
Exactly. So the moment a coastal state even suggests that they might impose a new toll, or hints that ships refusing to pay might be subjected to safety inspections, the maritime insurance markets react instantly.
Instantly.
Entities like Lloyd's of London or the Joint War Committee will evaluate the geopolitical temperature. And if the risk elevates, they declare the strait a listed area. And suddenly, shipping companies have to pay massive war risk breach premiums just to enter the water.
It's a huge financial hit. If you apply even a 1% additional premium on a modern megatanker and its cargo, you are adding hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, to a single voyage overnight.
And the shipping companies just pass that cost directly down the supply chain. The freight rates spike, the refineries pay more for the crude oil, and then a few weeks later, you, the consumer listening to this right now, you are paying significantly more for gasoline, heating oil, and plastics.
Yep.
The coastal state doesn't even need to physically block the strait or arrest a single ship. The mere legal ambiguity surrounding their intent is enough to weaponize the insurance markets against the global economy.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this economic cascade is precisely why major maritime powers have a zero-tolerance policy for any precedent being set in the Strait of Hormuz. It is never just about one specific body of water.
Because if a coastal state successfully normalizes a toll, even a really cleverly justified environmental monitoring fee in Hormuz, every other state sitting on a choke point takes notes.
Oh, absolutely. The global navigation regime would fragment almost immediately. You would see similar unilateral measures adopted at the Strait of Malacca, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Bosporus.
It would be chaos.
Instead of one unified framework governing the oceans, you would have a patchwork of hundreds of different local jurisdictions, each demanding their own specific fees, enforcing their own highly subjective environmental standards, and selectively targeting vessels based on local political grievances.
So the predictability of global trade would just evaporate entirely. You'd basically be replacing the constitution for the oceans with a global shakedown.
Which is exactly why maritime powers rely so heavily on historical practice, aggressive diplomacy, and continuous naval deployments just to keep these straits standardized. They are literally defending the entire architecture of global trade.
However, strategic vanguard does present the coastal state perspective as well, which I think requires serious consideration. The text acknowledges that coastal states bear immense, completely disproportionate burdens from this endless parade of global traffic.
They really do.
This is a crucial point. It is their coastline that faces catastrophic devastation if one of those megatankers suffers a structural failure or runs aground. They're the ones maintaining the radar systems, managing the traffic separation schemes, and dealing with the localized acoustic and atmospheric pollution.
Yeah.
The rest of the world effectively outsources the environmental risk of its energy addiction directly to these coastal states, and then strictly forbids them from charging a fee to actually manage that risk.
The coastal states are essentially subsidizing the global economy's infrastructure. It's a massive burden. And in response to this imbalance, scholars and legal analysts highlighted in the text suggest exploring what they call shared responsibility models.
I found this concept so fascinating. The idea is to establish cooperative funding arrangements. So the international community or the massive shipping consortiums that profit so heavily from utilizing the strait would contribute to a multilateral fund.
Right.
And that fund assists the coastal state in managing the environmental and security burdens.
It creates a real mechanism to address the coastal state's genuine vulnerabilities without undermining the legal sanctity of transit passage. It basically shifts the financial mechanism from a mandatory unilateral toll to a cooperative international investment in maritime security.
I mean, I look at that cooperative funding idea, and part of me thinks, well, isn't that just extortion with much better public relations?
Oh, yeah, I mean...
Because if the underlying threat is pay into this fund, or we might start heavily inspecting your ships, you are basically paying international protection money just to ensure your cargo doesn't get harassed.
You could definitely frame it cynically as protection money, certainly. Or, you could view it as an elegant, very pragmatic solution to an undeniable free rider problem. The globe benefits immensely from an open choke point, and currently, the coastal state absorbs nearly all the localized risk without any real compensation. A shared model aligns the financial incentives of both sides with the shared goal of safe, efficient navigation.
It is a really delicate balance between legal theory and geopolitical pragmatism. So, to summarize our deep dive into this document today, the foundation of maritime law, UNCLOS, makes it completely explicit that general transit tolls are illegal, ensuring straits remain open highways for global commerce. However, the ambiguity surrounding environmental fees creates this massive loophole for coastal states to assert leverage.
And tying it all together is the reality of the enforcement gap. Without a global police force, the rules-based maritime order is maintained not by courts, but by this incredibly volatile mixture of diplomatic pressure, naval deterrence, and economic maneuvering.
It's a perfect demonstration of how power, commerce, and law collide. Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with today. We just discussed those shared responsibility models and the debate over whether they represent an elegant solution or just formalized extortion. If the coastal states truly do bear the heavy environmental and security burdens of keeping our global economy running, should the international community preemptively start paying a subscription fee to maintain these major choke points?
Imagine if the UN established a global subscription model where maritime nations pay baseline maintenance fees to the states sitting on critical straits, rather than waiting for a geopolitical crisis or a sudden pole booth to force our hand. Think about how radically that would reshape the power dynamics and the financial flow of international relations. Keep questioning the hidden systems and the invisible laws that run our world. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
Subscribe to Ambat Legal Insight and stay legally informed with clear, practical, and reliable breakdowns of the law. Follow our channel and activate the bell icon so you never miss important legal updates, case analyses, and expert insights that matter to every citizen. Support our mission of spreading legal awareness by liking, sharing, and commenting, because your one action can help thousands become more legally empowered. Join the ALI community today across YouTube, podcast, and social platforms and take a step toward understanding your rights, your laws, and your justice. Ambat Legal Insight, because law is for everyone.